The assassination of JFK defined a generation. The debate still goes on whether Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone or not. It didn't matter that Oswald did not move to Dallas until the year before the shooting. Dallas was already labeled a city of hate. Texas Monthly magazine is the authority on all things Texas, and joining us on the phone is its senior executive, Paul Burka. Paul, thank you so much for being with us today. We do appreciate it.
Sure, thank you.
I think for those who are alive and can remember back that far, they have a very distinct memory about where they were and what they were doing when they heard about the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. Share your memories. Where were you and what do you remember?
I was a second-year student at the University of Texas School of Law, and my morning class was over, and we was heading over to a diner near the campus. Just a routine lunch, it seemed like. Went over there and ordered and ate lunch. And when I went up to pay, the cashier, who was a Hispanic lady, was in tears, and she had broken down sobbing. And I asked, "What's the matter?" And she said, "They killed the president." And it was awful, awful.
It shocked the very American consciousness. Can you talk a little bit about the reaction of this city that, as we described in the intro and you used in an article that you wrote, as the city of hate? I mean, JFK was not very popular in Texas at all, and in Dallas either at that time.
No, that's correct. And the Dallas Morning News, as a newspaper, spewed a lot of hate in those days. There was actually a dinner at the White House for Texas publishers, and the publisher of the Dallas Morning News rose and addressed Kennedy, and he said, "We need a man on horseback to lead this nation. And many people in Texas and the Southwest think you are riding Caroline's tricycle." That to the President of the United States as a guest in the White House. Gives you an idea of what it was like.
Yeah, and even so, there was that kind of vitriol. What was the reaction there in Dallas? And then go ahead and talk a little bit about how the fact that the assassination took place in Dallas, how that affected the city.
Well, the assassination was a terrible blot on Dallas for many years, and I think that the leading citizens of Dallas were extremely hostile to Kennedy, and for that matter, his running mate Lyndon Johnson. There were people who spat on Lyndon and Lady Bird at a hotel in Dallas. It was a out of control extremist attitude that had somehow taken over the city, and that there was a tremendous feeling, I think, afterwards in Dallas, a feeling of shame and a great concern whether the reputation of Dallas was going to take a tremendous hit, and it did, and it should have, but it really was out of control.
I think one of the iconic images of that terrible day not only was the actual assassination of the president, but of course the swearing in of the vice president, Lyndon B. Johnson, on Air Force One.
Yes, and I think in Robert Caro, of course, did the Johnson biography, and I think that's one of the most poignant passages in his whole 4 or 5 volume series on LBJ, was how Johnson acted in the swearing-in ceremony for him as the new president.
You know, by any official measure, it has been determined that Lee Harvey Oswald was the one and only shooter. He was the lone gunman in this assassination. But the conspiracy theories have persisted all these years, 50 years later. Why do you think people have clung so persistently to conspiracy theories about the assassination of Kennedy?
Well, in part, it was the setup of where the assassination route was, and remember there was a grassy knoll. That was one of the areas in the assassination, and there were always rumors for years that there were people on the grassy knolls, and that the shots actually came from the front at the car, which of course was not true. It came from the sixth floor of the Texas School Book Depository, if you believe that Lee Harvey Oswald was the shooter, which I do. So there were so many. I think there was a feeling in Dallas because of the extremism and because of the terrible events that there was some sort of conspiracy, perhaps, that was around it, but it has never been. Of course, it's never been proven, and I think all these years later, it's pretty certain that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone. But you'll still find people who think otherwise.
Certainly, and not the least of which those who were impressed by the Oliver Stone movie JFK. Yes,
and George Christian, who was LBJ's press secretary, was in despair over the Oliver Stone movie, and he told me, this is many years later, of course, that he was afraid that the movie would sink LBJ's reputation for all time. And it was actually rescued in the end by the director of the LBJ Presidential Library at the University of Texas, who released the Johnson tapes, which showed showed the much more human side of LBJ, and I think helped resurrect his reputation a great deal.
Let's talk about today. I know that there is a ceremony that's planned for Friday. I hopefully to have time to ask you about that. But let's talk about the ways Dallas has changed, both socially, demographically, and politically in these last 50 years.
Well, in 1963, the reason that Kennedy came to Texas was that there was a split in the Democratic Party in Texas, and Kennedy wanted to put it to rest, get Kennedy and Johnson and put that situation to rest. And so when he came there, that was the political purpose of the trip. And Dallas was a city that was. Texas had a very peculiar Democratic Party. It was split into liberal and conservative wings, and the conservatives were extreme conservatives, and they were trying to get that that situation in hand, and it had been festering for a couple of years. So that was the purpose of the trip, is in a political sense. But then after that. Dallas, of course, had this tremendous, as a collective city, Dallas had this era of shame and reacted because of the assassination. There was great fear in Dallas that the city would be marked for years. And to some extent, I think it was. I mean, it was considered a city of hate. There were all sorts of dark tales of politics in Dallas, and the billionaires and the oil billionaires in Dallas who were basically barons in their own right. They had their fiefdom. Yes. And the city was run by those people.
Paul, let me jump in and ask you, of course, the demographics have changed in Dallas now. What would be considered a minority population across the U.S. is in the majority there in Dallas. And even though Texas does silently remain a red state, there is a very large liberal contingency there in Dallas. But to what you were just talking about, although Dallas will forever be connected to this dark period in our United States history, do you feel like the city has gotten past the shame?
I think there's still people in Dallas who would say no, that this was something that has stained the city forever. When the assassination came up as an issue, in other words, when they were a year away, Dallas tried to figure out, how are we going to mark this day, and are we going to close off Dealey Plaza, or are we going to just face it and try to recreate the day as it happened? And it's true, Dallas is a very different city now than it was then, because the demographics in Dallas, as you mentioned, are totally different than it was then. It was almost an entirely white city, and now it is almost an entirely Hispanic and African-American city.
Right. Paul, I've got to jump in. We are completely out of time, but I want to thank you so much for taking some time, sharing your memories and your perspective.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye.
Well, it may be hard to imagine today with hundreds of television channels, but 50 years ago, television news was still in its infancy. That changed when shots rang out in Dallas, of course. As Loic Hofstede shows us, American viewers were glued to their sets as the national trauma unfolded.
President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time.
On November 22, 1963, eyes glued to their television sets, millions of Americans find out their president has died. The assassination of John Kennedy leaves the nation in a state of shock. Over the next few days, events unfold swiftly, and only television is able to inform the public in real time. Bob Huffaker was a reporter for CBS. He says this was a turning point in the media industry.
We were beginning to realize that television news was never going to be the same again. That now that we had begun to cover news from the spot, we would never go back again.
For the first time in US history, 3 television channels, CBS, ABC and NBC, broadcast live for over 72 hours. 3 days after the attack, the suspected killer Lee Harvey Oswald was gunned down by nightclub owner Jack Ruby, in full view of television cameras.
And then the third shot, boom!
It was the first live murder in history.
Reverberating shots. By 6 o'clock that night, 97% of the TV sets owned in the United States were on and stayed on. And people were glued to the coverage. The newspapers were doing what they could do, but things were happening so fast that it was a radio and television reporting event.
Newspapers struggled to keep up the pace set by television, but the world was already adapting to the constraints of broadcast journalism.
Suddenly, and I saw this happen within days of the assassination, people were holding press conferences, and they were holding up till the TV cameras all got set up.
And for these retirees, television sets were fast becoming an essential component of their household.
In front of the television, with the funeral, with the little boy doing his salute for his daddy, for Kennedy's son.
In the space of a weekend, television became the main source of information for many Americans, and it was to remain so for the next 40 years, until the advent of social media. But for many Americans, the memory of this fateful day will always be linked to their TV screens.